All right, hi. Good evening, everybody. Hello and welcome to Trust and Truth in a Polarized Era. Tonight's learning session is part of a 2-week symposium entitled Judaism, Citizenship, and Democracy from the Shalom Hartman Institute, a pluralistic think tank and educational center for the Jewish people. You can find out more about us and see more of our videos, articles, and podcasts at shalomhartman.org. We are proud to present this session in partnership with the National Museum of American Jewish History. My name is Dr. Michal Biton. I am a scholar in residence at Shalom Hartman, and I will be facilitating tonight's conversation with Yasha Monk. My colleague, Michael Grumer, is helping us out behind the scenes. For tonight, we have Yasha Monk, who is a German-American political scientist and the Associate Professor of the Practice of International Affairs at Johns Hopkins University. He is the author of 3 books, including a memoir about growing up as a Jew in modern Germany, and most recently a book about the populist rise across the world and how to renew and fight for liberal democracy. Yasha is a contributing editor at The Atlantic and is the founder and editor-in-chief of Persuasion, a publication invested in the principles underlying a free society. Yasha, it's really a pleasure and a privilege to be having this conversation. I've been a big fan of your work and really admire the way that you're really making the case for liberalism and for democracy and helping us think about the norms and the values that we need to nourish in order to sustain that. So let's start our conversation by talking a little bit about the breakdown of trust. I feel like every time I talk to people that I hear from leaders, everybody's talking about a crisis of trust, perhaps being about in a post-truth era when we don't know who to trust, what institutions, what people, what social media, what information, what narratives of ourselves and others. So as a political scientist who's really trying to understand democracies and societies and their health and well-being, how do you measure the level of trust that a society has? And how does the crisis or breakdown of trust manifest?
I see you're really easing me in with the easy question.
Yes.
There's different measures you can look at in terms of whether people trust institutions and so on. I mean, one of them is just to ask about approval ratings for institutions for particular individuals. One of the early pieces of work I did before 2016, before it sort of became fashionable to talk about the crisis of democracy and so on, was to look at the faith that people have, not just in their government, but in the democratic system itself. So what we saw for a long time is that people participated in politics less than they used to, that they joined political parties less than they used to in many countries, that they had more negative appraisals of particular politicians, that on average, they were less likely to say the president or prime minister of a country is doing a good job. And so people were a little bit worried about that. But the standard response in political science was to say, no, this is good. This is just people becoming more demanding, more critical. That's not something to worry about. They're still as invested in our political system itself. And so what I found with my colleague Roberto Foa in 2014, 2015, was that actually they had started having much more negative attitudes if you look specifically at the political system. So when you say, how do you feel about democracy? How open are you to authoritarian alternatives to democracy? And so on and so forth. They also had much more negative views. And that was one way that we were saying, no, there's a deep crisis of trust in institutions. It's not just that people are, looking a little bit more closely at what the political leaders are doing, they're actually getting disengaged from the political system itself. So that's one kind of way of looking at it. There's other ways of looking at it too, but I think that finding is pretty clear. And we see it right now in the coronavirus pandemic, the extent to which people are mistrusting the word of scientists, the extent to which there are, growing movements that say that they're not going to take a vaccine if or when it is approved, and even people who claim that the whole thing is made up, right? And that really this disease doesn't really exist, or it's some kind of ploy to, harm an incumbent president or shut down the economy, or, whatever other conspiracy theories are going around there.
Yeah, so when we're talking about not trusting the system, so help me understand, are we talking about people saying that democracy itself cannot exist or flourish, or that our specific system is not living up to its democratic values and its ideals?
Well, it's a little bit of both, right? I mean, I think one way of thinking about this is just whether people feel like at bottom, those who are in power mean well and are doing a decent job. So in my book, With People versus Democracy, I talk about this a little bit in the context of economic growth. In the United States, we used to have very rapid economic growth in living standards for the average citizen, right? So from 1935 to 1960, the living standard of an average American doubles. From 1960 to 1985, it doubles again. And I think people at the time had a kind of, ground level trust, which is to say that they never, I'm in Washington, D.C. right now, they never thought that Washington, D.C. is the paragon of moral virtue, but most politicians are wonderful people, right? I mean, you had elite anti-political sentiment all through American history. But because the lived experience was that something in the system was working, I think there was still a sense like, in the end, let them do their thing. They may not be the most moral of people. I may not trust them completely, right? I might not give my wallet to them and expect them to return it, but something in the system seems to be working. So let's let them do their thing, right? Whereas I think now there's a sense that there hasn't been growth in living standard for average citizens in the last 30 years. And that was true essentially, before March and April of this year. So before the sort of economic devastation that a lot of lower income Americans are going through right now. And so I was starting to say, no, I really don't trust them at all. If nothing is working out for me, it must be that they're out to get me, that they don't care about me, that they care about other kinds of people rather than me. And I think that kind of lack of trust makes people angry. It makes people willing to vote for extreme candidates. It makes them much more open to saying, well, perhaps there's actually nothing worth preserving in our political system, and somebody comes in and says, let's do something completely different. That's something that we should entertain.
Right. And I feel like in addition to what you're saying, I'm seeing additional parts of not trusting each other. Some of it has to do with social media and really feeling like we don't know what in front of us is disinformation or misinformation, or even putting that aside, knowing that people who have different partisan opinions than me actually experience a totally different reality. That can be something that can destabilize my ability to trust what I'm seeing. And I'm also seeing a certain lack of trust, and I know I'm using it in different ways, but even on the narratives that we used to hold, right, of America being a great country that was doing good things, that was going to be a place where there's equality for everybody. So how do you understand these different factors kind of coexisting with each other to shape this moment?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. I mean, one way of thinking about what's going on through social media, I would split into two parts, right? One is that before social media, we perhaps had too much trust or trust in the wrong way, right? I mean, when I think about the trust that I used to have in the New York Times, say, I think some of it was actually too much trust, right? Because I didn't, perhaps if they reported on something that I really knew about, I knew, oh, you know what, I didn't feel like quite get it right. Not that they're lying or that they're fake news or something like that, but just that it's hard to encapsulate a complicated set of things in 800 words, and journalists have their own political lens and precepts for which they perceive the world, and perhaps they're not all that expert in the topic, and then they mess some things up, right? So perhaps sometimes I would see a glimpse of that if they reported on something I really knew about. Most of the time, I would read those newspapers growing up and saying, well, that's how it is, right? All the news that's fit to print, this is what the world is. And now, when they get something wrong, I see somebody do a Twitter thread about it that goes viral. Say, hey, actually, here's the receipts. Like you got this fact wrong, you got that fact wrong, you got this wrong. And so every day you can be on Twitter and you can see the institution fail. And it probably has failed on a bunch of things while still being a serious newspaper and so on, all the way through its history. But we weren't as viscerally aware of that. And social media makes it easier for others to sort of contest authority in ways that can be positive, because we become more aware of the failings of establishment institutions, but it can also be negative because it can breed a kind of cynicism where we suddenly say, oh, look, there's no difference at all between somebody's random blog and the New York Times, because here's all the instances that the New York Times got something wrong. Well, maybe the New York Times actually gets most things right and at least tries to get things right, has some process of correcting things when it goes wrong, whereas the blog is just out there lying about stuff. But it becomes easy to conflate that kind of difference, right? And then, of course, there's the second aspect of this, which is that people can now actively push fake news and lies and all of those things and there's no real way of containing that, right? So it used to be that we lived in a world of what sociologists call one-to-many communication. So if you wanted to have a big audience, you had to have a huge machinery of things, right? You had to own a printing press and be able to employ, 500 people and have a nationwide distribution network. And that way, somebody could write something in New York and then, hundreds of thousands of people around the country would read it. But that means that there was a number of establishment players, gatekeepers, who could sort of decide what news was fit to print and what news wasn't fit to print, right? The same in television. You needed to have access to a television studio and all of those kinds of things. Well, that's changed, right? I mean, here we are, 100, 200 people, and we're speaking through Zoom, right? Like this is, I don't know how much it costs the Hartman Institute to have the Zoom license that allows it to broadcast like that, but it's a trivial expense compared to what would have been necessary to reach a wider audience earlier on. And the same is true in print, obviously, right? I mean, if I tweet something viral, it might be seen by millions of people, at no cost to me, at no infrastructure I have, at no startup cost. And again, I see that as an ambivalent thing, because it does bring to the fore important voices that perhaps were ignored in the past, that perhaps were left out of a conversation in the past. But of course, some of those voices also don't have the sense of responsibility and of institutional role training and of accountability
right.
that you would have had if you'd made things up in a newspaper in the past.
Right. So if we take this into account, there is a certain, almost like reordering of society that we're living through in many different layers, whether it has to do with authority or communication means, or even like forms of new technology, artificial intelligence, things that allow for the proliferation of a lot of these things. So I guess my question is, for many of us, we're eagerly or not so eagerly, depends how optimistic we feel, waiting for the election and feeling like something transformational can happen in terms of, safeguarding the path of our republic and the like. But how many of these issues are going to really remain with us, like regardless of who wins on November 3rd?
Well, I guess I would distinguish between an acute crisis and a set of structural problems, right? I think Donald Trump in office is an acute crisis.
Right.
I think the way in which this administration has attacked certainly trust in the government and norms of truth-telling from office. Newspapers are trying to sort of list all of the lies that Donald Trump has told since taking office, and I don't know, I think it's in the 10,000s now. That makes things a lot worse. The attacks on democratic institutions make things a lot worse. The way in which the basic rules and norms of our Republican system of government have been attacked is an acute crisis. And though I'm not shy about pointing out some of the liberal elements and tendencies that we're also seeing on parts of political left in the United States, I think it is undoubtedly true that if Joe Biden wins next week, as the poll suggests he will, we'll see whether they're accurate, that acute crisis is going to subside. And I'm sure that there will be executive overreach in the Joe Biden administration as well. There's been executive overreach in every US presidential administration. It'll be important to hold his feet to the fire when he does those things. But the basic ethos is going to be one of respect for the rules and norms of our democratic republic. And that will be a huge change of situation from what we have right now, in my mind. Now, you are also right that there's a set of structural issues about a lack of trust in political institutions, media institutions, and about, the deep dislike that a lot of Americans have for each other. And that sadly, the more educated and the more politically interested Americans are, the more deeply they hate each other, which is something very interesting about this moment, isn't it? I think that actually, if you go into the middle of a country and you talk to people who are not all that interested in politics, they have their fights and they have their disagreements, but they kind of get along, actually. But if you go to, a fancy university, or if you go to, for that matter, sort of very elite, country club somewhere, in conservative territory, you will find a bunch of people who really hate a large segment of their fellow Americans, and that's not going to go away. In Persuasion, we had a great article by a writer who I respect very much, an evangelical Christian by the name of David French, who's been
he's one of the favorite people that I read.
Yeah, no, he's just a wonderful writer, and he wrote a very nice story about what you have to believe in conspiracy theories, right? I mean, if you look at some of the beliefs of QAnon, and it's all of these leading politicians are secretly sort of engaged in some kind of pedophile activity, and it's sort of huge pedophilic conspiracy of some sort. And he rightly points out that to believe that, you really have to have hatred, right? You really have to think these are bad human beings to be capable of that. And I think that tells us something about the problems we're going to be.
And that's another crisis of trust, I think, like not being able to trust each other, that we can't see each other as people who might have good principles or good values, but differing policies. And I know that a lot of your work around persuasion really has been to kind of try to get people to talk to each other and not past each other, and try to find common ground or common values. So I guess I have two questions to you, or a two-part question. One is, what can individual citizens do in terms of trying to ameliorate this toxic, I would say, political polarization and lack of trust between each other? But then the second question, we might actually contradict the first, so you might actually bring some clarity to my own questions, is how would you respond to the critics who say that by trying to build bridges with, let's say, people who support or enable politicians who might be eroding our democracy, that we're actually enabling really bad things to happen to our country, and that as such, the project shouldn't be one to build bridges, but actually just to counter each other and see who shouts louder and who gets to pass more laws and more policies?
Yeah, well, in 1953, there was a movement in East Germany of workers who wanted better working conditions. They had a new communist government, but had promised great improvements for workers, and it turned out that actually life was still very hard for workers, and so there was a protest movement, one of the early protest movements in the Eastern Bloc, it was cruelly crushed, as the protest movement in Budapest was 3 years later, and the protest movement in Prague was 15 years later. And Bertolt Brecht, the playwright, wrote a lovely poem on the occasion, in which he said that the Communist Party had decided to dissolve the people and elect one of its own. I think that there is a little bit of that temptation in contemporary United States as well. It's to say that, look, if Americans were capable of voting for Donald Trump, then they're so bad and they're so beyond hope that we should give up on them. And anybody who, if Trump is evil, so if you voted for Trump, you're evil. And so if you want to persuade somebody who is evil to be in your camp, then you must be evil too. So the best and most virtuous thing to do is just to mobilize the base and never try to persuade anybody, because we are bad people, right? And like the wrong side of this. And look, this is not how democracy works, right? I mean, in a democracy, you need to be able to win over your fellow citizens. And you need to have some trust that though they will sometimes disagree with you, and though they might sometimes make genuine mistakes, they are in fact capable of moral suasion, and they're capable of recognizing mistakes, and they're capable of standing up for decent values. There's this famous line about, that I'd rather be ruled by the first 100 people in the telephone book of Cambridge, Massachusetts, than by the assembled faculty of Harvard University. And when I first heard that line, I sort of thought that was sort of anti-intellectual, anti-elitist. But I think if you believe in democracy, you need to believe that. You need to believe that the first 100 people in the telephone book actually have some ability to perceive the world and to change their mind if they've made a mistake, and to be decent.
Right.
And I have that. I mean, I actually think that you've seen a lot of people change their minds. I mean, there's been both political candidates and some political scientists who've been saying there's no longer any swing voters, there's no longer any people who change their minds. What we're seeing very interestingly is, first of all, that at least according to the polls, there's going to be a lot more people voting against Donald Trump this year than 4 years ago. But secondly, there's actually been a very interesting swap in who supports each candidate. So Donald Trump has actually gained votes among people of color in the last 4 years. According to all of the polls we have, he's going to be doing a little bit better among African Americans and significantly better among Latinos than he did 4 years ago. Joe Biden is going to be doing much better among older voters and much better among white voters than he did 4 years ago. So there's a lot of people who've changed their minds in the last 4 years, and a lot of people who voted for Trump who decided that's a mistake. So look, we just have...
Although,
yeah, go ahead.
No, I was going to say, Asha, there's a little bit of a catch-22 though, because you're saying in a democracy, we got to persuade each other, but also we've got a camp that arguably is trying to erode democracy and democratic norms. So that's like an interesting work of trying to say, as long as we still have this working, we have to do the hard work of persuading each other. And we haven't reached the point where this doesn't work anymore.
But I don't think that, you see, I don't think that there's a trade-off between being very, very clear about the politicians and the individuals who are threatening democratic institutions and expressing solidarity with and sympathy for our fellow citizens who may have supported them. In Turkey is a case in which an authoritarian populist has really managed to take over the institutions. It's a model of one of the things I was afraid of in the first months and years of Donald Trump. Now, it turns out that people like Recep Erdogan and Viktor Orban and so on are all disciplined and strategic. And that thankfully Donald Trump, if there was a populist Olympics, would not take medal rank. And so I think he's done a lot less damage to our institutions actually than Orban has to Hungarian democratic institutions and Erdogan has in Turkey. But even despite the crushing of democratic institutions in Turkey, a politician managed to win a very important mayoral election in Istanbul a year or two ago. And he did that coming from a traditionally secular party that always had the reputation, unfairly or to some extent fairly, that they look down on devout Turks. And he was very clear in his criticisms of Erdogan, didn't hold back at all in warning about how dangerous Erdogan is and how much damage he's done to the interests of ordinary Turks. But he also did a tour of mosques around Istanbul, showing that he was open to conversation with devout voters and that his was a candidacy, as he said it, of love, in a way that really helped to make inroads there. And I think in a certain kind of way, Joe Biden has taken a similar tack. Joe Biden is not shy about pointing out that he thinks Donald Trump is a dangerous man and an immoral man. But he does not have that hate for people who voted for Trump.
Right.
And I think that's what makes him a good candidate, actually.
Right. And there's something actually optimistic about what you're saying, that we should not hold on to these rigid narratives, that everything has been figured out and that we just have to fight each other, that we can actually maybe make a change by talking to each other and persuading each other, which I think is optimistic and hopeful. And I hope that we see the fruits of that optimism. But let me ask you.
I earned a reputation as a pessimist when I started warning about the dangers to democracy before it was fashionable. But now I'm trying to unearn my reputation for pessimism, because I'm a pretty optimistic person in general, and I at this point find myself much more optimistic about the future of America than many of my colleagues.
Well, that's really good to hear and exciting to hear. Let me ask you an additional question, which actually has to do with the American Jewish community, because when I try to think about, and I think both of us are Jewish Americans who weren't born here, so I think we have an interesting perspective in terms of this being our adopted country. But I've been thinking a lot about what does the crisis of trust look like for Jewish Americans, and I've been thinking about 3 different levels of that crisis of trust. One is a lack of faith in America itself. I was recalling a fantastic article written in 1955 by Ben Halpern called "America is Different," in which he basically argues that America is the only, he called it like this post-emancipation country in which Jews didn't have to prove themselves to gain rights. They were just like accepted in the system. So there was a certain American Jewish exceptionalism of America somehow breaking the mold of anti-Semitism, and the rise of white nationalism has actually led to a crisis of trust in America itself. Is America really different, or is it the same? The second crisis of trust that I've been thinking about is a crisis of trust in our own narratives. I think a lot of the Jewish American narrative has been one in which we speak not only of America being exceptional, but of us contributing to the American dream through tikkun olam, through perfecting the world, and through doing good things. And with so much rising awareness about racism in our society and different questions around privilege, there's been a reckoning of like, can we even trust our own narrative of having been in the right side of history in terms of this country being great and us, being part of that, or have we been enabling something darker? And then the third layer, and this might be present in different sides of the political aisle, which definitely exists in the Jewish community. The third level of a crisis of trust that I've been noticing is really feeling like whenever we see the erosion of liberal norms and liberal systems, that can actually be very dangerous for Jews, because if liberalism, and arguably it was, right? If liberalism was or is the system that allows for the flourishing of a minority community such as Jews in America, what would our fate look like once that's eroded? So that's a little bit of what I have been observing, and I was wondering if you have any thoughts about it, especially as someone who has a more global point of view with regards to these things.
Yeah. Well, let me start off by talking about the third one of these, which is the one that I thought the most about. And I certainly think that, when you look at many of the moments when Jews flourished, it was at moments of tolerance, not always democratic tolerance, I suppose. I mean, there was periods in multi-ethnic empires where Jews were treated relatively well in the past and so on. When you had enlightened monarchs of some form or another who sort of were reasonably tolerant. But that was always provisional. And when you look at the few places where Jews could feel self-confident in their standing in society, it is because these basic values of liberal democracy seemed very deeply enshrined. And the liberal element of that is very important. The philosophical liberal element is not liberal versus conservative in the sort of more contemporary political sense of the United States.
Could you tease those out for us as we're talking? What are those elements?
Yeah, so look, the democratic element, right, is that we rule ourselves. But as we know, if you're a small minority, the fact that we rule ourselves in itself is not necessarily great protection, because if a majority says you have to go to church, and if you don't, then you're not welcome here, that might be a genuinely democratic society in the sense that what the majority says goes, but that's not going to be very hospitable for minorities. So that's why you need the second element, which political scientists call liberal, and I kind of have a hate-love relationship with the term, because no matter how much you emphasize it, that doesn't mean that you're like left-wing or something. That's still how it reads in the United States. But that is not about self-government as much as it's about individual rights. So it is to say that, yes, the majority rules, but there's certain things in which the collective doesn't get to say anything to the individual, no matter what the majority wants to say. So the majority does not get to tell me what I'm allowed to say or not say. The majority does not get to tell me who I'm supposed to or allowed to have over for dinner, or who's allowed to stay over at my house after dinner. And the majority also doesn't get to tell me what religion I should pursue and whether to have any sort of religious convictions at all. And in order to sustain that liberal element, you need independent political institutions, because if a president or prime minister isn't constrained, if they can do whatever they want, then they may start to tell you, no, actually, your religious practice is not okay. And so we are going to persecute you. So you need the executive to be constrained in the power it has in order to sustain that individual liberty. And so what's very worrying to me about the rise of authoritarian populism around the world, of which I see Donald Trump as one representative, but people like Viktor Orban in Hungary and the Polish government as another representative, Narendra Modi in India as a representative, Recep Erdogan in Turkey, but also some left-wing populists like Hugo Chavez in Venezuela in the past. as well as obviously his successor now. What's worrying about that is precisely that they claim, I am the people, right? I alone am the truly legitimate representative of the people, and anybody who disagrees with me is illegitimate. And so, when a court says, hey, you can't do that, like even though you're legitimately elected, this is starting to tell individuals how to live and actually want to, retain this sphere in which they can make their own decisions. They say, who are you as a judge to tell me what to do? I am the people, I am elected, you are not. So I get to decide whatever I want. And that's, I think, the link between this growing assault on liberal democracy, on our foundational political institutions, and the way in which it puts at risk all kinds of minorities, including Jews.
Right. And I guess part of my question is the following. There have been, I think, rising critiques of liberalism as a system from both the right and the left, actually, in its different articulations. And for those of us who identify as believing in these liberal principles and in these liberal norms, I would say as well, part of me wonders, how do we resist the urge to have this sort of nostalgia and believe that we can return to the way things were, or at least felt, some time ago? Are we able to distill some of the key values or principles, and also take in some of the critiques that we're seeing of liberalism and work towards a new system that can still protect the rights of minority groups like Jewish Americans or others?
Well, look, no ambitious set of ideals has ever been fully realized on Earth, and never will be. And so I think it's very important that we recognize the extent to which some of the claims that liberal democracies have made about themselves, and certainly specifically some of the claims that the United States has always made about itself, never quite corresponded to reality, the painful ways in which we have failed to live up to them. And that should be, motivation and fuel for us to do better. So I completely agree with that. I would say, though, that it's important to get the basic narrative right. There's a lot of, and perhaps this is where I'm again sort of more optimistic than everybody else, there's a lot of resistance to trying to emphasize the good things in our country and our society, because I think people sort of read it as glib. They read it as, oh, you see, don't worry at all, why focus on the injustices when there's good things? And since the injustices are very real and they're very significant, people don't take that well usually. But I think it's nevertheless important to have a realistic assessment of where we are, which includes the good as well as the bad. And that's that it makes a huge difference whether things have been getting worse and nothing in the system seems to be working, in which case the right answer might be just throw it on the ash heap of history and start anew, or whether actually we're making progress and we're doing better than other societies. And so when I ask those two questions about the United States and France and Germany and a few other developed democracies around the world today, I think it's very, very obvious that there have virtually never in the history of mankind been more inclusive societies that have done better at providing real opportunity for people across racial and religious groups and giving them a lot of freedom to lead lives in accordance with the values they hold. And I think it's very, very clear that though we still have a long way to go, America does better on that metric today than it did 30 or 50 or 70 years ago, a lot better, actually. And so, both of those things push me into saying that yes, we need to keep fighting for improvements, and we should be impatient about that, and we should not at all be glib or self-satisfied. But there are things that we're doing right, and we're not, in fact, going to make progress towards racial justice, towards economic justice, towards real inclusion, if we pretend that we haven't been making progress, if we think that trying something completely new is likely to put us in a better position.
Right. And in a sense, you're having a comparative frame that both looks right now at other societies and also looks at the American past, and saying that I guess against both metrics, we're doing better. That's interesting. What you said right now reminded me, I forgot where I read it, but I read of in the same way that we have like American exceptionalism, in which people think of America as exceptionally good and moral and ethical, there's like the negative or the inverse of that. Those who see, I don't even know, they read it in Persuasion, I don't know, but who see America as exceptionally bad or going backwards. So just to let everybody know.
Ironies here, actually, I think that's a really interesting point. So one irony is precisely that so many Americans, flip from thinking that this country is wonderful and perfect, and it's the beacon of the world, and then perhaps they think that when they're in high school or something, and then they take a college course and they learn, they read Howard Zinn or something, or they learn about all the crimes of American history, and suddenly they're like, this country is worse than any other country, and our sins are worse than those of any other country, and look at how terrible everything is. And I think that's as glib and simplistic, and often perhaps more glib and simplistic than reading that is rebellious. And part of that, by the way, that I find very interesting is that a lot of people who critique Western-centric view of the world, or an ethnocentric view of the world, or the sort of imperialism of certain sort of cultural values, often actually have an incredibly imperialistic view of the world, in which they perceive every political debate and tension in other countries completely through the lens of American debates and cultural fights. And that's a sort of second-tier irony along the same lines.
Right. And in a sense, it helps to not have been born here or to have lived in other places, because it helps you kind of not do so much navel gazing and not perhaps have the misconceptions that come from looking at the world through an American gaze. So I'm going to ask a couple more questions, but I just want to remind the audience that you can submit questions. So please feel free to do so in the Q&A button. But I have another question. I wonder, do you think there's a special or particular role that minority faith communities, like the Jewish American community, as much as we can call it one community, as opposed to many communities and many people, but is there a particular role in what we can do to strengthen democracy, to strengthen the trust in each other, or in our or in the liberal institutions that we need to move forward?
Yeah. Well, I mean, I think that there is a role to be played, both within the community and outside of it. I mean, I do think that as Jews, we should have a particular awareness of how important these democratic institutions are. Of the point I was making a minute ago, in a way, which is that I think as Jews, we should recognize the fundamental political point that our world can always be better than it is, and we should push to make it better than it is, and it's urgent to try and make it better than it is. But we, of all people, should also know that the worst that politics can do weighs a lot more heavily than the best it might become. When you think of the best society in the history of the world, I don't know, I mean, perhaps it's Denmark today, or perhaps it's, I mean, whatever you want to, whatever floats your boat, you can say that's the country, that's the best in the history of the world. It's pretty good, probably, but it also has lots and lots of problems, and you could go there and complain about a million things. When you think about the worst places in the history of the world, have very little to redeem them, and very little to recommend themselves. And so I think that's an important lesson that I think Jews are particularly apt to bear in mind and to communicate. But then I think there are all kinds of ways in which the rich civic life that Jews have built in America can help us stand up for things in everyday life, in our communities, in the towns and cities in which we are, beyond our own communities, and at the national level in politics. And I actually think that a lot of Jewish organizations have done very well on that over the course of the last 4 years.
Well, that's wonderful, and it's making me think a lot about the burdens and privileges of Jewish history and what it does to us. And we understand the stakes, I think, in many of these things. So I'm going to start just sharing some questions from the audience. So the first question is actually trying to ask for some comparative perspective with what's happening in Israel. So do you have thoughts about the practice of democracy in the state of Israel today, with active demonstrations supporting democracy and showing anger towards the current leadership / ruling coalition?
So I'm really not an expert on Israeli politics, and I'm sure that there's many people here, and probably you, Michal, who can speak to that much better than I can. I will say that whatever you feel about other parts of his policies and so on, Bibi Netanyahu strikes me as having transformed himself from a relatively establishment politician into a sort of Israeli variant of a populist. When you think about what I talked about in terms of respect for independent institutions and for respect for democratic rules and norms, it's quite clear to me that he lacks that in important ways, that he is in fact trying to undermine those independent power centers and to delegitimize them, to vilify the opposition, to capture state media. And as a scholar of democracy, that worries me.
Yeah, interesting. Actually, just from what you're saying, I've had some recent conversations with some friends in the Jewish community. We have very different political opinions, and we're kind of like drawing different lessons from Jewish history. Some of us are drawing the lessons, we need the democratic systems, right? We need these systems who are going to be these liberal systems with independent checks and balances institutions, and that's going to help us flourish. And then there's people who say, no, we need to have power on our side, right? The way to move forward is, I don't care what kind of leader we have, populism is okay as long as it's on our side. And if all of these populist individuals are, let's say, helping the state of Israel or Zionism or whatever that is, then that's good enough for what we want right now.
Well, I guess I would just say that that might be a false binary. I mean, Israel, is an astoundingly powerful state, given how vulnerable its position has always been, and continues to be in certain ways. But I think that comes from its vibrant democratic institutions. I don't think Israel would be what it is today if it hadn't had those institutions since its founding. And of course, one of the problems with international power and realpolitik, which a small state like Israel certainly has to engage in to some extent, but one of the great pitfalls is that if you stake your alliances and your relationships with other countries on personal relationships between particular leaders who are, who happen to be in the same political mode, in this case, sort of adherents of a kind of right-wing populism, then you become quite vulnerable when those leaders change in those other countries. And so, perhaps in the short run, Israel can become friends of Hungary by Netanyahu and Orban getting along. Whether this will be a lasting partnership that actually is to the benefit of Israelis for years and decades, I'm somewhat doubtful of. And, you might say the same about the extent to which Israel has positioned itself on one side of the partisan divide within the United States. That's probably not in the interest of ensuring that there is bipartisan support for Israel for a long time.
Right. So some of the questions that I'm seeing come up on the chat, a couple of them are in a similar place. And broadly, the question is, if you believe that Trump is doing real evil, some examples could be like the separating families at the border and the like, and then like losing track of children's parents and really doing terrible things. How can you not see the people who vote for him as being terrible, despite knowing what he has done? And I think this goes back, Yasha, to what you were saying before. Can you distinguish between the leader and his supporters / enablers? And can we really overcome the sort of partisanship and polarization that we have if we feel so passionately and strongly about the wrong, or if for some of us evil that is happening through this administration?
Yeah, well, a few things. I mean, one question is who, why they voted for somebody at what point. Another question is, whether you're judging the action or them as people. I mean, I think we all have members of our families or friends who have political opinions that we find repellent. With Thanksgiving coming up, even though I suppose it'll be a Zoomsgiving for many people this year. Yeah. I'm sure you can think of a proverbial uncle or whoever that fills that criterion in your family. And yet, you probably know that they might be a very decent human being who is very kind and loving in all kinds of other contexts. It's just that on politics, they have opinions which wrongly or probably rightly, you find horrifying. And so I think we should try and have the same empathy for other people in the country, to say that many of them are, leading decent lives, which can be altruistic and which can be, admirable in many ways, and yet they just have deeply unpleasant political views. So that's one thing to say. I think another thing that I would add to that, because I see that you're sort of about to stick the knife in me.
No, just a follow-up question.
Is that I think, look, it helps to see that one of the main narratives about Trump voters, I think, just isn't true. So look, the best predictor of whether somebody voted for Trump in 2016 is simply whether they voted for Republicans for a long time before that. And we live in a deeply partisan country, in which it would take a lot to change your mind. If you're a convinced Democrat, as I am, think about what it would take for you to vote for the Republican rather than the Democrat. I mean, how many terrible things would the Democratic candidate have to do to say, I'm going to vote for Republican instead, right? Now, I wish that wasn't the case, and I wish more people had realized that Donald Trump is not a traditional Republican, and that they need to really change their mind in that election. But it's that's not completely surprising that not so many people did. Now, the other thing I want to say is that there's a sort of narrative that people voted for Trump because of those horrible things. So those horrible things made him really, really popular. And I think the best evidence points in the other direction. Trump's bigotry probably helped him mobilize, a part of a Republican primary electorate and win the primary election. By the time of the general election, it most likely hurt him. You can see that because in the polls he kept going down in the most controversial moments, and that the majority of Americans always rejected the most unpleasant things he said. And we've seen it, I think, in the development since. So just one example is, when you ask Americans today how Trump is doing on the economy or on COVID, he has pretty bad marks. But people make some excuses. So I sat in on a focus group of women who had voted for Trump in 2016, who are now on the fence. And when you ask them about, what do you think of Trump's handling of COVID, they say, yeah, it's not been great, but it's hard. Nobody's had to deal with that kind of pandemic before, and it's really difficult. So they kind of made excuses for him. When you asked them about Trump's handling of race relations, they were really, really livid. They're really, really angry, right? They were saying it's just terrible and unacceptable. And that's reflected in the polls. So the thing on which Trump has the least good marks in polls is his handling of race relations. So I just don't think that Americans voted him for that. I think they voted for him because the team on The Apprentice, because they thought he makes all these big promises, perhaps something will come of this. He seems to have a successful business career. Let's give him a shot. I don't buy, to go back to your first question, Michal, that the political system is working very well at all. I don't trust that any of this is working. So, let's send this guy in, he'll shake some things up, and perhaps something will come of that. And I think a lot of Americans now say, that was a mistake. He never was able to do anything. None of his promises came true. And you know what? The stuff that he said in the campaign trail, where I was able to look past it because I thought, well, he's not going to actually do anything so bad. It turns out he has done really, really terrible things. And so I'm changing my mind.
Right. I'm just curious, is there, sometimes in Jewish talk around Jewish law, we talk about the slippery slope, like you do one thing wrong and then like it's going to, is there a slippery slope argument? Like, is there a point where you cannot distinguish, when you cannot have empathy between someone who supports a candidate whose policies you think are morally wrong? Like, what's that look like in a society? You know what I mean?
What's the slippery slope that you're going to start also having empathy for the murderer next door, or that you? Or
no,
that
the argument. Sorry, I'll continue. And I'm not making this argument. I've heard it, okay, but I don't know if I agree with it. The argument is, well, what would have happened? And again, I think we're not in this place at all. But let's say, like the rise of Nazi Germany. Like, what happens when you continue? And I'm not saying the same at all. But what happens when you continuously say, okay, let's have empathy. Let's try to work together. Let's, And I'm somebody who really believes in actually trying to work together. But I've heard that argument, and I'm curious how you feel about it.
Well, I mean, look, in a democracy, you just can't write off 50% of the people. I mean, you just can't. I mean, like just numerically, you can't, right?
Right.
If you're not in the political realm, feel free to sit in your bedroom and or living room and curse, 99% of humanity. And perhaps 99% of humanity deserves to be cursed, right? Perhaps 99% of humanity is bad and evil, and is, deserves to suffer. I mean, I think, as if we're having a philosophical debate, that may or may not be true. But if if you believe that we should live in a democratic system in which our president is chosen by the majority, or by the majority in a certain set of states or whatever for the electoral college, then you have to have some belief and faith and trust that you can in fact persuade them of doing something decent. And if you don't, then you have to tell me what alternative system you're thinking up. And
Right.
All of the flaws of democracy, I think that alternative system probably is not going to be any better, right? So look, I'm not being naive. I'm not saying everybody is wonderful and you should just love everybody and so on and so forth. That's not what I'm saying. But to make a democracy work, you just cannot be on the moral high horse of judging half of your fellow citizens to be irredeemably evil, because at that point you've given up on democracy.
And it's a self-fulfilling prophecy.
Half our fellow citizens are irredeemably evil, and I hope that we're getting good proof of that.
Yeah. So let me ask you just a couple of questions, and you can address them together. We had one question about what are tools to kind of speak to each other across difference, like to really persuade or try to find common ground, and if you can share some of that. And then a second question is, what are things we can do about the breakdown on expertise that we have seen so much of that around COVID, that it's not only about political institutions, it's also like, do we even trust scientists or the like?
Yeah. Well, on the first question, I think it's helpful to understand that everybody's the hero of their own story, with few exceptions. I mean, there's some sociopaths, right? There's some people who think I'm a bad person, and the effects of what I do in the world and what political beliefs I have in the world are bad, but that gives me pleasure, or it serves my interests, and so I don't care, right? I mean, those people exist, but they're very, very few. There's not many sociopaths in the world. So most people have a story about themselves where they say, what I do in the world, sometimes I mess up and sometimes I make mistakes and I've made people suffer, and I'm aware of it. But by and large, I'm a good person who makes the world a better place. And, I'm voting for this candidate, not just because, they'll lower my taxes or they'll do this or that. It's because I think that what they stand for is right and just. And I think if you realize that, then you owe it at least to understand the story that people tell about why their political beliefs make them the hero in their own story, why that is in fact good and decent. Now, it doesn't mean that you have to agree with that, right? I strongly disagree with the idea that Donald Trump makes this world a better place. I think he makes it a much, much, much worse place. But I think a good starting point to trying to persuade somebody is to understand, all right, what makes you the hero in your own story? And then how can I convince you that in fact, the person you're supporting doesn't do that, right? If you're saying, hey, I'm standing up for what's good and just in the world, and I think Trump does that because of X and Y, then I can start having an argument and say, okay, look, I hear you. I see you're not a terrible human being. I see you don't just want to go and make people suffer. But if you want to be the hero in your own story, if you want to think that Trump makes the world a better place, how can you justify something like the separation of kids and parents at the border, right? How does that fit into that story? And I think if you do that in a respectful way, which can still be an insistent way, it can still be an impassioned way, that can put more pressure on people's view of the world than if you start off by saying, if you vote for Trump, you're an asshole and you're a bad human being. So, let me lecture you.
And any thoughts on the question around expertise, and how do we maybe work towards having more trust in our society towards that?
Yeah,
easy questions.
You started off with such a easy question, and the questions have just kept on being easy. So look, I think I don't know. I mean, here's one thing I managed to tell people when they come up with conspiracy theories, and I don't think it helps very much either, but it's the best I've been able to come up with. So if somebody has something better to come up with, please put it, instead of a question in the chat. But it's, like when people say, build a book, they get together and they decide everything, right? And say, all right, look, imagine like your 10 best friends, right? And we fly you to a fancy villa for 10 days, or for 3 days or 4 days, for a week, whatever. And you have to agree on how to rule the world and an action plan on how to do that and on all of your goals. Would you be able to agree on that? And would you be able to come up with a decent plan? And I think people start to realize, oh, that would be really hard, actually, because like my one friend thinks this and the other friend thinks that and the other friend thinks that, right? And I think that's a good way, when people say, look, all of this is a conspiracy by all of these scientists and so on, I'm actually get them to think about, well, how does that work, right? Like, how do they coordinate? How do they get into the same page? How do they implement this whole plan? And the answer is, well, they don't, because it would be incredibly hard and difficult to do, right? Now, I think there's a reason why people prefer the vision of the grand conspiracy, because it's actually comforting. Right. I think the truth of the world is that it's a very chaotic place. It's very, very hard to govern, and nobody actually is in control of it. And it means that we can have all kinds of terrible outcomes without anybody trying to put that outcome into place, particularly. And that's pretty scary and disorienting. Right. Now, I think the conspiracy mindset is actually in some ways more comforting. Well, there's evil people out there in the world, and they rule and govern everything. But if only we somehow weren't evil, or if only we managed to get rid of them and replace them with decent people like you and me, then everything will be great, right? It's actually a more hopeful story. And I think that's what makes it powerful. So that's why it's hard to fight against. But I think, yeah, just tell people, like, how does this actually work? And this conspiracy and so on, like, how do people do this? Do you really think they're capable of doing that?
Right. It's so interesting, Yasha. I was looking forward to tonight. I thought it would be an interesting conversation. I didn't expect it to be so hopeful and so optimistic. And honestly, I'm walking away like thinking, morally, right? What does it mean to kind of remind ourselves we live in this democracy and it's the best we got, and we got to work really hard. And perhaps some of the optimism is actually difficult because it means that we have to do the hard work. Because we believe that we can fix the system. It's actually kind of easier to be cynical and say, okay, it's irredeemable, and also abdicate any role that we have in both, having taken part in that system or perpetuating it. So I'm really grateful for this optimism and this almost like moral hope and mandate to action. So I just want to give you, if you want to just take the last couple of minutes, if you want to share anything about the building blocks of your optimism right now, or I know I'm like ending in a positive high note, or ways that you hope that we are optimistic in a productive way, in a way that asks that we do the difficult work.
Yeah. Well, two things. I mean, one is that when you look around the world, we live in the best epoch that human history has ever had. I encourage everybody to go to The World in Data, which is a great website that shows that, infant mortality is way, way, way lower than it was at any point in human history. Literacy is way higher than it was at any moment in human history. Life expectancy is way, way higher than it was at any moment in human history. Over the last 20 years, we've lifted 2 billion people around the world out of poverty into modest affluence. But that makes a huge difference. People didn't have running water, who didn't have electricity, who didn't have access to an education, who now have those things. So, spending a little bit of time again out of the United States and being a little bit less provincial. Go to India, go to China, go to some of those societies that, for all of their deep, deep problems, actually have an optimistic view of what we can achieve. And that's the same is true of Nigeria and of Kenya and of other societies in Africa. I think helps to be optimistic. When what democracy is concerned, the big pessimistic lesson of the last 5 years is that people don't sufficiently appreciate our democratic institutions. There's a great joke that David Foster Wallace used to tell, that two young fish meet an old fish in the sea. And the old fish sort of mutters a greeting, says, "Oh, good morning, boys. Good morning, boys. How's the water?" And they sort of smile and swim on. And when they're out of earshot, one of the fish says to the other, "Water? What's that old fish on about? What is water?" Right? So they live in the water and they need the water to survive. They don't know what water is. I think one of the really pessimistic lessons of the last 5 years is that that's true of many citizens of democracy. So we don't recognize how much our democratic institutions are giving us and how decent they make our lives. I think the positive lesson, I think of hopefully the election in the United States, we'll see next week, is that when these things start to be threatened and imperiled, people do tend to realize and to recognize that when these things are under threat, we start to rally around them. And sometimes that's too late. In many countries around the world, it has been too late. Let's hope that it's not going to be too late in the United States.
Right. Well, thank you so much. This was really, really wonderful. Thank you everybody for listening. A reminder to please leave us feedback in the session webpage. And I hope we have good news next week for us, for the Republic and for democracy everywhere. And want to thank you again, Yasha, and wish everybody a good night. Thank you.